Okay, Lauren, we're ready to go.
Okay, great. Did you introduce me already?
Yes, and I forgot to unmute before I did that, which is why you didn't hear it.
No problem. I saw you talking and I was gonna say, "Hey, wait." But it looked like you did a fine job introducing me. Well, good evening, everyone. It is great to, I guess, see some of you and be on the Zoom. I am actually in McKendree University where I teach at. I'm in my office right now, which is in the suburbs on the Illinois side of St. Louis, Missouri. And so, like many of you, I went and saw the eclipse today and it was amazing. And I can kind of feel a little bit of pink rising on my cheeks right now from being outside. But I'm glad that you were able to make it back safely and join us tonight for this presentation. Jim invited me, actually, I looked at our email exchange, it was last July, so July of 2023. So when Jim invited me to speak to you all, I was really excited, but when I said yes, I had no idea that in the meantime, the Michigan Wolverines would become national champions. So I definitely cheered for you in the national championship. So congratulations for those of you who are Wolverine fans. And I actually have a very near and dear colleague who teaches, he's a professor of history at Adrian College, which is kind of nearby you all. And just a little bit background about me is I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, born and raised there, huge Steelers fan. And as you heard from my bio, I've lived a bunch of different places east of the Mississippi until very recently. Well, actually, it hasn't been recent. 7 years ago, I moved to St. Louis to begin my tenure track position here at McKendree University. And so tonight I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I've been working on for over a decade. And it's very near and dear to me because it was kind of a lengthy research project. It began as a master's thesis, then turned into a dissertation for my PhD, and now is a book that was originally came out as hardcover. Now it's in paperback. And I think it's just such a fascinating topic that I really enjoy speaking about it. And it's one of those topics that I began in the Park Service. So it's very, public and popular, but it also can be academic as well. So it kind of is great for all audiences. And I just love being able to speak to roundtables because I feel like my college students, as much as I love them, sometimes they just don't want to be there. And I know you all really want to be there tonight. So thank you. And also, I'm a Yankee, and a lot of the topics or a lot of the talks I give are in the South. So it's exciting to be at a Michigan event. And yeah, so without further ado, the way I would like to get started tonight is to just give you two little stories to introduce you to the men who are fraternizing, what fraternization is, and what's transpiring throughout the Civil War regarding this topic that I study, which is fraternization. And so the first incident that I'm going to give you today is actually between a Georgian and a Pennsylvanian. And so this first incident that I have for you is it happens a couple months after the Battle of Fredericksburg, a few months before the Battle of Chancellorsville, and it's between the armies of Northern Virginia and the armies of the Potomac in that kind of winter quarter period, about 5 months along the Rappahannock River. And so the first man that I'm going to talk about is this man right here. His name is Private Milton Barrett, and he is in the 18th Georgia Infantry. And on the night of February 20th, 1863, Barrett comes back from a 24-hour picket duty post along the banks of the Rappahannock River. And the next day, he writes a letter home to his brother and his sister. And here's what he says. He says, "Our regiment just came off picket. We stood close together and could talk to each other. Then, when the officers were not present, we exchanged papers. We managed this with a small boat. Some of our boys went over and actually stayed a while. The Yankees would let us know when to come back. This correspondence has to be kept secret from the officers. And so Barrett and his men had exchanged newspapers with the enemy using a small boat. And as he said, some of his comrades actually went over to the Union lines and spoke with these men in person. So on the other side of that river is a soldier named John Steffen, and he's of the 71st Pennsylvania Infantry. And so about 150 yards, that's how wide the Rappahannock is at that point, stood U.S. soldiers holding their side of the river in Falmouth, Virginia. And after his turn on picket duty, similarly, John comes back from his 24-hour shift, and he writes a letter to his friend. And when he writes the letter, he says this. He includes a actual paper that he got from a Confederate soldier. So he says, this paper was floated across the river to me by one of the Secesh pickets. And while reading it on the bank of the river, he asked me how I liked the paper. This paper I should have delivered at brigade headquarters according to our orders, but thinking that I might as well just send it home. And so Stefan received this paper, and instead of giving it to his officer during inspection, he hid it, then put it in a letter home, and then sent it home to his friend. And I read these letters in the archives, and unfortunately, the rebel paper did not make it into the archives, but nevertheless, it was really neat to see that he actually wanted to send it. So sadly, both Barrett and Stefan do not survive the war. Barrett sadly was captured at Port Royal, and he actually died in the deadliest prison camp in the US, which was Elmira in New York State. And John Stefan was sadly mortally wounded on July 3rd at Gettysburg. So unfortunately, these men would not live to see another year. So kind of in when I study this, I kind of see these lighthearted moments as, they're young boys having fun, obviously not knowing that their life will sadly end shortly. So that's kind of the first experience. So we have two private soldiers, one Union, one Confederate. And so the next incident I want to kind of introduce you to is a little bit different. Now it happens a year later. It's in a completely different theater. It's in northern Georgia, so northwest Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. And it happens with two different armies, the Army of the Tennessee River, or sorry, the Army of the Tennessee, Sherman's army, as well as the Army of the Cumberland. So all of the armies that he takes over when Grant comes to Virginia. So it's Sherman's armies in Georgia. And then they are opposed to Joe Johnson and later John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee. And so about a year and some change after the Rappahannock River, we see something very similar happen on the Chattahoochee River, except for this time I want to kind of tell you what happens between the private soldier's perspective and then his officer's perspective. So this man right here is a New Yorker. His name's Private Henry Welch, and he's of the 123rd New York Infantry. And so Welch exchanges papers and talks with a Confederate soldier while on picket duty along Allatoona Creek, and which is kind of a little creek that latches on to the Chattahoochee, which is further in the south. And so what Welch writes in his diary that day is, our picket line is in speaking distance of the rebel pickets. We exchange papers with them every day. They think, or did think, that Lee was whipping Grant badly. They say that they are going to drive us out of Georgia. They also say that Hooker's men fight differently than Western troops do. They wanted to know if Hooker's men were mostly regular soldiers. So a few corps from the Army of Northern Virginia go down to help with Chattanooga and then later the Atlanta campaign. So these are what these Confederate soldiers are saying to Welch and his men. So this exchange of newspapers and information and secrets along Allatoona Creek is what we saw happening the previous winter on the Rappahannock, except for someone is watching this happen. And the man who's watching this is Brigadier General Alpheus Williams. So he is a divisional commander under the Army of the Cumberland. And when he watches this happen, he is just beside himself and so shocked that private soldiers could actually do this, even though officers are doing it too, right? But how could my men partake in such activities? And so what William says, and he actually writes this in a letter to his teenage daughter, so that's kind of interesting. He's telling his daughter this. He says, for the last few days, our pickets completely fraternized. They have been exchanging papers, coffee, tobacco, and the like. The next day, I found them actually sitting together in the banks of a small stream. I was obliged to stop this fraternal intercourse. Isn't it strange that men in mortal strife 1 hour are affectionate, or in mortal strife 1 hour are on affectionate terms the next, and apparently fast friends? Strange are the incidents of war. And so what we see here is kind of the disconnect between a private soldier and his divisional commander, because as a divisional commander, he doesn't understand how men could just compartmentalize the enemy from someone they're trying to kill to somebody who they are able to empathize with and, share commodities and information like they've been friends. But Welch is somebody who we see throughout the war, and who I'm going to talk about tonight are these soldiers who do it. And the questions we're going to answer tonight are kind of like why they do it, how they do it, where they do it. And so this kind of incident is kind of, the launching pad into not only my study of soldier fraternization in my book, but for what I'm excited for us to talk about tonight. And just as a side note, General Williams did survive the war, but sadly, Henry Welch, when he wrote this letter about fraternizing, in less than a month, he would be killed at the Battle of Peachtree Creek during the Atlanta campaign. So he made it to Atlanta, but was killed. And so sadly, again, this incident, which seemed so lighthearted for him, I see as a, rather like I wouldn't say happy, but at least something that is on the lighter side of war, considering especially that this young man was about to be killed in action less than a month later. And so the four men that I just introduced you to is kind of my vignette for the talk to present to you soldier fraternization. And so when we talk about soldier fraternization, today in modern military terms, it could be fraternizing, with people in the ranks with civilians, or, people who are of a higher rank than you. But what it meant for the Civil War is basically, like this Mort Kunstler painting shows exactly kind of what we saw with Barrett and Stephen. Is you see this is after the Battle of Fredericksburg, because you can see the city in the back, the icy waters of the Rappahannock River, and we see kind of the Confederate soldier with his Union coffee in his hand, and we see the US soldier with his Southern tobacco and his pipe. And so they obviously just exchange these commodities, and it's a peaceful kind of quiet moment on the Rappahannock. And we see that in Gods and Generals. And so in the film Gods and Generals, we see that scene played out almost identically to the Kunstler painting. We also see fraternization in the film Gettysburg. Now it's a little different because the Confederate soldiers were captured, so they weren't necessarily like free will participants, but they still, talked with the US soldier. And so we see fraternization in the popular film Gettysburg, which was my gateway into the Civil War, because I think I was like 8 when it came out. And so that was kind of what launched me into studying Civil War. And then here you see a picture of me when I worked at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And so when I was a park ranger there, I would talk about the fraternization. In fact, we were kind of encouraged to talk about it as a lighter side of war. And there was an exhibit in the Fredericksburg Visitor Center that, obviously, if you see the name of the exhibit, it's the name of my book. So I used that exhibit title because I thought that oxymoron just is such an attention grabber. But yeah, you can see there was actually, museum exhibits dedicated to it. And when you talk about, soldiers exchanging coffee and tobacco throughout the Civil War, most people have heard of it. And not only have we heard of it, we usually will connect it to something else that I heard you all talking about on your business meeting later, which is World War I, right? And so sometimes we'll connect soldier fraternization during the Civil War to the Christmas Eve truce on the Western Front in 1914. And so this idea of soldiers being able to kind of put down their gun and come together as men is actually really fascinating. And it's something that I still continue to think about. And I can't wait to hear your thoughts tonight and get your take on it, because I have many theories, and a lot of them I have evidence, to prove those theories. But I feel like there's an exhaustive list. It's not exhaustive, the way that we can kind of try to understand and grapple with why soldiers do this and how they're able to do it. Because one of the most interesting things is, like, the men who fraternize don't leave, they don't skedaddle or go AWOL, they continue fighting. So it's important, but it also isn't as earth-shattering as you would think, like, oh, they met someone from the other side, so they leave. They still know their duty, and they still carry out their mission. And so the kind of plan I would like to do for tonight is to just take you into my research and how I did this project, by showing you kind of like how I was able to identify, like, who was a fraternizer. And then kind of look at where it happened, because I call them my hot spots where fraternization happens most. And spoiler alert, it's when armies are together for long periods of time. So in places where they come together, fight, and then they distance themselves, namely is Gettysburg. Like, they get there, they fight, and then aside from some stragglers and some, obviously, like, the hospitals, there's not many people left behind, so there's just not a lot of fraternization at Gettysburg. But when we talk about Petersburg, where the armies are across from one another for almost 11 months, like, there's going to be a lot of fraternization. So we'll talk about where, we'll talk about how they're able to do it, and most importantly, the question of why. Why do these men essentially risk their lives, and they're standing in their own armies to do something essentially that's nice for the enemy? So that's what we're going to do tonight. So on this map, I have each little blue dot you see. I just kind of wanted to show you where I did my research. So you can see kind of the Midwest is a little sparse. I went to Florida State, so I was able to go through the Deep South. And then I was able to spend some time on the East Coast and in Virginia with fellowships and grant money. However, when I was at the Army War College in Pennsylvania, I got a lot of information from Michiganders, from Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois soldiers, especially even fraternizers in the famous Iron Brigade. And so a lot of the research that I have for U.S. soldiers came from the Army War College in Carlisle. And you also can find, people since the war have moved to other states, and they will give it, to the closest archives. So I was able to find in my research, I have men that have fraternized from every single state in the United States and every single state in the Confederacy, with the exception of Arkansas. I never was able to find an Arkansas soldier who fraternized. But you can see that if you can see by the number of states I looked in and the number of archives I went to, I was able to read about 500 soldiers' letters and diaries, or I should say 500 soldiers. And I read all of their letters and diaries. And out of the 500 soldiers, I found 150 of them who fraternized. And so what I did is I made some data, or I compiled the data to analyze it and kind of put, where the men, which country they are fighting for, their state, their unit, the army in which they fought for, their position, their rank, whether they were volunteer or conscripted soldier, as well as who they were writing to and whether it was in a letter or a diary. And then I also went on to kind of look at, where they fraternized, the year, and then what they did when they fraternized. So were they exchanging newspapers? Were they negotiating a ceasefire? Were they mailing letters? Were they just joking with the enemy? So I kind of was able to kind of make some data points and find what I call the hot spots of fraternization. And so if you look at this map, you'll see a few blue dots again. But these are where fraternization happened most frequently. And so if we look at the two dots in Virginia, that would be Fredericksburg, so kind of the winter warfare on the Rappahannock, and then Petersburg. And so kind of the, 1863 through 1865 in Virginia. But obviously those are very different types of combat. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, like picket duty versus siege warfare. Fraternization is going to change right alongside the way the tactics evolved during the Civil War. If you look at what we call the Western Theater, all the way on the Mississippi River, that's Vicksburg. And so that's the first place we'll see soldiers fraternize is during the Vicksburg campaign. So as early as May 1863. And then they will fraternize during the siege of Chattanooga. And then if you kind of move southeast, you'll see the fraternization that takes place at kind of the Kennesaw Mountain area on the campaign to Atlanta, and then Atlanta. Now, there are other places that fraternization happened. I have accounts as early as Bull Run in July 1861, all the way through Five Forks in 1865. So it definitely happens elsewhere, but I wanted to hone in on the places where it happened most frequently to kind of figure out like why it's happening. And so these are kind of the places that you're going to hear about throughout my talk and what you'll obviously see throughout my book. So what I want to start with kind of is how soldiers fraternize, right? That's the big thing. Like, how were they able to do this? And so there's one way that soldiers are really able to fraternize, and that was kind of what we saw in the opening, stories of the men I talked about to begin the talk, which is during picket duty. And so what happens is when soldiers have a shift on picket duty, it's in front of the main body of troops or it's on winter encampment. And initially, in the beginning years of the war, picket duty was meant for people to be on guard. So while you were out there, you're not supposed to engage. In fact, you're not really supposed to fire on the enemy. But if you see that things are happening and, there's movement or we see troops massing up, then we need to go alert someone that there could be an attack or the troops are moving, right? So you're basically there on guard, but one of the things that isn't really talked about is it's 24 hours and you can't sleep and you can't have a fire. So you're freezing, you're exhausted, and obviously you're probably very angry because it's cold and you're tired and uncaffeinated, right? And so it's not a fun shift. And so what happens is usually picket duty will be across a space, like kind of a ravine, or in many cases, a river. And so river is kind of a permeable boundary. And not only is it permeable, it's like, well, whose side is that? Is that my side? Is it the enemy side? And it's actually kind of both. It's a neutral space. And so what we're going to see is when soldiers, as men, we always talk about their comrades, right? The things they do in camp, the conversations they have, what they do, they read the news, they play cards, they go to the settler's tent, they get things that they can share. They talk about home, they talk about politics, all the things that they're doing in camp is going to expand across that permeable boundary, across that neutral space and include the enemy's camp. And so, for example, Egbert, a Signal Corps member, which is kind of rare because usually Signal Corps members are quite far from the main body in order to be able to communicate a long distance. But something that he said in a letter home was he found a boat, a little toy boat that came across the Rappahannock, that it was made. Okay, so soldiers are making these little boats. And on the boat, there was a packet, and it was found to be loaded with mail. And he says, on deck, we found a Charleston paper, the Richmond Examiner, and a couple of other papers, all neatly folded and in perfect condition, accompanied with the request, please send us the latest you have. And so he said he and his men took the papers off that little boat. And then on the boat, they put a New York Herald, a Philadelphia Inquirer, and a Harper's Weekly, and pushed the boat. And he says the packet sail trimmed and turned for Secesh again and kind of pushed it back across the river. And so the fact that men are using their picket duty time to construct these little boats and share these newspapers with the enemy shows that, they were obviously bored, they had some time, but they also were reaching out to get information. And in some cases, oh, sorry, I had a picture about that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's the picture. So here you can see these US soldiers are making their little toy boats and they're sending them across to the Confederate lines. And you can see on this boat in particular was like a little stash of coffee, right? Because US soldiers had coffee in abundance, Confederates did not because of the blockade. And so coffee was hard to come by in Confederate lines, whereas US soldiers, they had enough coffee, but they also wanted some of the Southern tobacco. So Confederates would, reward, their colleague or their antagonist with the tobacco for the coffee. So that was what we would see exchanged quite frequently. Now, if the water was shallow enough, or if there was land in between, we would see soldiers actually go into that neutral space and meet and then go with the enemy to the opposing lines. Or here you see two cavalry soldiers able to, because of their horses, able to get out into the middle of the river in order to exchange commodities. And so a U.S. infantryman, he actually wrote in a letter to his wife, he said, two men out of our company took a little boat and went across the river and exchanged newspapers with them. So after the Battle of Fredericksburg, pontoon bridges were constructed for the U.S. troops to get across the river. And some of those pontoon boats were kind of left around. And so a few of the men in his company got in that boat and went across the river physically to get the newspapers. So we can see that men are either using boats, constructing boats, or using horses, or walking, or wading across the river in order to make these exchanges. And so it's not just happening in Virginia, it also happens in Mississippi, Tennessee, and Georgia too. And so South Carolinian Chesley Mossman, he is a fascinating, him and his brother have fascinating letters. And he wrote one of his letters in front of Lookout Mountain. So this is at the siege of Chattanooga. He says, the pickets of each army go down to the stream for water. And it frequently happens that squads of men from each side go down at the same time, and they confront each other face to face about 5 paces apart. The only thing that's separating them is the little stream. And so a good deal of chafing generally occurs. So we got a lot of banter, a lot of male banter and joking. Imagine that, right? And then they swap papers. And so he says that we swap papers, knives, coffee, and tobacco. Pen knives and coffee are in great demand here in the Southern Confederacy. He said, but I won after rations because he was hungry. And he said he actually paid $6. I'm not sure, I'm guessing it was US dollars, for a hat. So we actually used some money to get a hat. So we see these little black market underground economies happening. So if men aren't just seeing it as a fair trade, they'll actually, use money and create these little trade, barter, and cash systems that are happening in between the lines. So everything that I just described, all of these examples, are actually happening during winter quarters or picket duty, where soldiers have great opportunities to communicate with the enemy because they are told really not to fire on their enemy. So it's kind of seen as a quiet encampment for the most part. And so when I started my initial research, I thought, well, when that changes later in 64 and 65, I guess fraternization must just go away. Because if you have orders to fire, you're certainly not going to talk to your enemy. You're going to keep up a guard all the time. However, soldiers are going to take it upon themselves to change fraternization too. And I feel like this is the most important type of fraternization we see throughout the war. And so what we see is when soldiers are asked to dig in. So if you see this picture, this is on the cover of my book, you see the abattis in the background, you see the siege warfare where you see the trees cut down. And so what we see is when we see sieges at Vicksburg, Chattanooga, Atlanta, even Nashville and Petersburg, we see that soldiers are on guard when they're in the front lines. They're not just there to warn of an attack, they're shooting anything that they see. And so what we think is, well, men will just stop going out in front of the lines. But what they actually are going to do is keep up those trade networks and keep up those ability to exchange information by negotiating ceasefires. And here's how they learn it. So what happens is occasionally during a siege, especially in the summer months, officers will call a white flag of truce so that units can go out and collect their dead and bury their dead. And so if you're not on burial detail, you're kind of just standing around. And so we see this especially in May and June leading up to the siege of Vicksburg, is Grant and Pemberton's men would just exchange things. Like while they're not on picket duty, or sorry, when they're not on burial duty, they would honestly just go back and forth saying, hey, is anybody from Alabama? I have a sister in Alabama. Can you mail this to her? I mean, they just have this free for all where they're not fighting, they're not in any danger, and they're able to be friendly and get things. Essentially, they're getting things that they need, whether it be information or commodities. And so what happens is while this is going on, soldiers realize, wow, if we call a ceasefire, our life gets substantially easier and we are no longer under threat. So what we see happen is no longer are soldiers going to wait for officers to call a ceasefire. Instead, they are going to call the ceasefire themselves. And here's how they do it, because I have so many accounts of this that it's just miraculous how much these men are craving peace. They are under so much danger, they've been through so much, and to just be able to survive the day, you can see these men will go to any extent to lessen hostilities, including the actual antagonist that you're trying to defeat. And so, for example, a Pennsylvanian named John Smith wrote, we have a trench outside 5 feet deep that the artillery fired at all night. The Johnnies made an agreement with our pickets not to fire at one another because they are so close there. And if either party should have orders to advance, they agreed that we or they will fire 2 warning shots in the air to let them know the agreement was broke. And so what these men are saying is, we're just going to stop firing. But if we absolutely have to, we will fire 2 blank shots to let you know that it's over, that we have to go back to fighting. Similarly, Charles Wellington Reed described, the day before yesterday, our pickets and the Red pickets established an armistice early in the morning and agreed not to fire on one another. And so the ability to say, hey, let's not sharpshoot at one another. Let's just walk around. Let's relax. Let's eat. Let's write letters. Let's not be on guard. And let's live through the day. You can see that this live and let live culture is beginning to take on a life of its own amongst soldiers in the ranks. They don't need the officers to call a white flag of truce. Instead, they're going to do it themselves. New Yorker Sylvanus Markham stated, I was out yesterday and we made an agreement with the Johnnies in front of us not to shoot at each other unless we were ordered to advance. So we lay there all day without firing at each other. We would get out of our pits and walk around and talk with each other at a distance. Sometimes talking with each other, you would think we are the best of friends. And so to see the grim realities of trench warfare by these veterans later in the war, juxtaposed with the way Markham kind of describes this easy, kind of carefree day, you can see why men use the enemy to create these negotiations. And not only that, but go to the lengths to be able to say, hey, we're not going to break these ceasefires. We're going to warn you first to keep and uphold them in this gentleman's agreement. And as you see in this photo, once the ceasefires were arranged, it was kind of free game to fraternize. So here men are playing euchre, they would smoke, coffee, tobacco, alcohol rations, food, newspapers, letters. They would trade souvenirs like buckles and or belt buckles and buttons. And so it just became this way to just boys being boys amidst, as you even see in this picture, kind of the smoke of this like burnt landscape in the background. And so the ceasefires is just about survival, right? So we're going to fraternize with the enemy to create, or at least increase our chances of surviving the day. And so after describing kind of both of those, kind of the kind of picket duty types of fraternization and then the ceasefire types of fraternization, they essentially want to do the same thing, but in one case, a friendly space was kind of constructed for them, and the other one, they constructed it themselves. And so the biggest question is kind of why did soldiers fraternize, right? Why did they do this? And so here are some of my reasons, and there's plenty more. And I would love to hear some of your thoughts again when I wrap up. But one of the first reasons is it's just very practical. They're bored. Um, they are bored. It's a lot of obviously strain on their body and their physical. We always think of like the physical sides of war, but their emotional and mental kind of mindset is taking hits from many different angles. And so when we are bored, we have an idle mind and it tends to wander and then it tends to ruminate and get anxious. And so, in ways to kind of alleviate boredom, we can make little boats and read newspapers from the other side, right? It seems kind of silly, but we have to remember like soldiers are in camp more than they're in combat, which is a good thing because combat is obviously the most, horrific part of soldiering, but they are, marching a lot, they're working a lot, they're on inspection a lot. And so when they have downtime, right, they want to be entertained. And so the idea of fraternization can kind of pique that interest. So boredom is kind of the first and the most basic. And then it's to obtain rare commodities, like we had talked about with the blockade. Confederates are freezing and they're on, a 24-hour shift. They need caffeine. And US soldiers want the tobacco hit, right? We also want to get the information that we're not getting from our own armies. We want to get that from newspapers. And so men are practical and they're saying, how can we find ways to get things that our armies won't provide for us? The third is information. And I think this is really important because we can sit here and say to ourselves, like, what day? It's April 8th, right? We can say, well, tomorrow is Appomattox Day, right? So just hold on one more day, boys, because the war is going to be over tomorrow. But we know that because we have the advantage of hindsight. For our soldiers, they don't. And so the anxiety of what's next, right? Or what is happening in other campaigns, what's happening in the Lincoln administration, emancipation, what's going on with prisoner exchanges, right? Those bigger kind of issues that are impacting not only our chances of survival, but is the actual sacrifice I'm making at this moment going to be worth it, right? And we really see that information is vital because the only thing soldiers have to really rely on is camp rumors, their own newspapers, or letters from the home front. And letters from the home front are great, but they're usually outdated by the time they get there. And newspapers are okay, but they're your own side's narrative, right? So if you can get enemy papers or get word from the enemy on what's going on, you then can start to place kind of yourself in what's next, what's to come, what are the future sacrifices I have to make. We really see this happen at Petersburg because at Petersburg, when Sherman is moving through Georgia, Grant knows that this is happening. And so he tells Union soldiers to go fraternize with Confederates and tell them if they surrender and come to Union lines, they will be given free transportation to anywhere in the North, 3 days rations, and will not be tried as a prisoner. And so he says, yeah, go fraternize with them and tell them about this plea bargain because these are, soldiers who might be a little bit nervous about Sherman's army moving through their homes, and desertion just skyrockets in the fall, winter, and spring of 65. And it's honestly how Grant's really going to win is by just chipping away at Lee's army. And so the idea to say to people like, hey, this is the information we have, this is what we're doing, and using fraternization as a tactic to chip away at your enemy lessens bloodshed. And it's very savvy and it's very kind of almost ahead of its time for the civil warfare. And so information is vital. And if we can use actual information rather than camp rumors or speculation to kind of quell our anxieties, I think that that's why soldiers are quick to want to say, let's get these newspapers and be able to trade. So one of the things that's really important to think about is how veteran soldiers, hardened soldiers, are going to eventually be able to see themselves in one another. Now, I will say the average fraternizer is a white American born. We see a little German, a little Irish fraternization, but for the most part, they're Protestant native-born white men. And so they can very easily see themselves in their enemy. And when they begin to see, their enemy's grit, and their determination and their longevity, the causes and the ideologies begin to kind of go on the periphery. And what they really see their purpose is to survive, fight for the men next to me, and make it home, right? And they realize, wow, the guys across from us are doing the exact same thing. And so the perspective of the enemy begins to evolve throughout the war. Now, there's still the enemy that we're trying to defeat. And then there's the 7th Virginia across from us, and they have these, good tobacco and good papers, and they've been out here all day in the sun. They look disheveled like us. Let's just not fire on each other, right? So you can see how men are able to kind of individualize the enemy in front of them at this moment versus the enemy, the Confederacy or the US, right? So we can see men begin to see themselves and have that empathy. And obviously race is a major factor, so is religion, so is a coming of age in American kind of antebellum culture. So there's a lot of that here that's going to help that. But the perspective of the enemy obviously is going to evolve, especially in comparison to stay-at-home politicians, right? If you are a Southerner and you own 20 or more slaves, you're exempt from combat, just like if you are a Northerner and you can pay for a substitute, right? So this idea of kind of the stay-at-homes versus us in the trenches really begins to solidify at the end of the war. I already talked about this a lot, but survival, right? Sure, coffee and tobacco and information are nice, but if we can negotiate a ceasefire and I'm not going to be fired upon for 24 hours, then that sounds like a great plan to me. And so soldiers fraternizing in order to negotiate ceasefires is a life-preserving measure. And I think that that's kind of what General Alpheus Williams at the beginning just quite really didn't understand. And there's that disconnect between men and the officers who lead them. And then last but not least, is because it was against orders. And I teach adolescent men in college, and I know many of you might have family members who are of that age range of, the age men are when they fight. And boys like to break rules. Women too, I should say women too, right? But we like to test boundaries and we like to see how much we can get away with, right? And there's a time old thing of saying like, well, you can't do that. And then when you're in this military hierarchy, it's like, well, wait, I can, right? And how much can I get away with without kind of fully getting in big trouble, right? Or people writing in their letters home, like, guess what Lauren Thompson did today, right? And fraternization becomes kind of this intermediary where it's against orders. So men are like, yes, I'm still in control. I still have autonomy. Look what I did to make my day better. But also, it doesn't carry the stigma of some of the more egregious types of what we see some soldiers do. And so, for example, I just want to put up here, I'm going to let you read this real quick. I'm going to run outside and turn off this light. Okay, so this is what Meade says. This is right after Cold Harbor. And Meade issues this to the Army of the Potomac and is basically just saying, the fraternization needs to end. Okay, no communication, no meeting with them. We don't care what it is, it's strictly prohibited and it's been happening and it's no longer tolerated. And about a month later, Lee's going to do the same thing. And Lee's going to say, this communication and this visiting one another and this intercourse, whatever's going on, unless it's absolutely under a flag of truce, needs to stop. And if you see the enemy, they need to be fired upon. And you can see that, they say it's injurious to the service and it's subversive of discipline. And I'm sure the high command is also kind of perplexed as to why it's happening, but they obviously want it to stop because it is again desensitizing their men to the enemy, and we don't want that, right? And so what we see, and this is what's so interesting about fraternization is there is nothing about it in the Articles of War, but during the Civil War, because it's happening so frequently, the United States is going to issue Article 56, which is relieving the enemy with victuals, and Article 57, which is holding correspondence with and giving intelligence to the enemy. And so you see below is a group of men who were under court martial. And so they were going, these are men in the Army of the Cumberland who were going to their court martial. And you can see the picture on the left is kind of the court martial ledgers that are in the National Archives. And I went there, I went to DC, and I read about 50 cases of soldiers who were written up, US soldiers who were written up under Articles 56 and 57. And about half of them were found guilty and the other half were acquitted. And what's very interesting is the ones who were acquitted because they would say things like, I didn't know it was wrong. Or I didn't know I wasn't allowed to do it because my officer was doing it, or everybody was doing it. So they kind of were able to play like, kind of plead like, I had no idea, and they actually got out of them. The other way they were able to is it was just a he said, so there was no evidence. For the men who were found guilty, it was about 30 of them were found guilty. It was because they either had like the rebel paper on them, so that was the tangible proof, or there was one of their officers, and obviously there's a lot of ratting out of one another because a lot of people want promotions, but you would see like a lot of the officers were like, oh, look who I found doing this. And so sometimes you could see that an officer was trying to get in good with his officer in order to get a promotion. But in terms of what we see in the court martial records, fraternization was quite, I would say, kind of not very high on the list of things that court martial cases really focused on. And it makes sense because the penalties that were given out for fraternization were pretty light. Men would have to forfeit pay for 3 months, which is obviously not light, but in comparison to a firing squad, it's not as bad. So they might lose pay for 3 months. They might be sentenced to hard labor for a month. Or the one that is always kind of the one that we always are like, is they get embarrassed in front of the regiment. So they would call, roll in the morning, and then they would introduce you as kind of a coward or what you did wrong. So it's like public humiliation, forfeiture of pay. If you were an officer, you might get reduction in the ranks, or you would just get maybe a month of hard labor. But regardless, it's not something men frowned upon because it wasn't as egregious as things that we see with drinking, disorderly conduct, refusal to move, to work, right? Disobedience. And so that's why soldiers write home in their diaries and letters so much about fraternization, which makes it a great topic to study because, unfortunately, for soldiers who do really bad things like sexual assault, fighting with their officers, drunkenness, disorderly conduct, they're not going to write about it home, right? They're extremely embarrassed to let anybody know. And many soldiers do it, but they're just, not going to write their wife and say, hey, babe, I'm under court martial because I got drunk and I punched my officer last night, right? They're not going to say it. But whereas fraternization, they just write about it, which is a beautiful thing, at least for me when I was doing this project, because I could find it really easily and not have to read between the lines or read about somebody else doing it. I could read about the men who did it, and they were quite, candid in their letters home about doing it. They almost seemed proud of it. And so fraternization, completely against orders, but nevertheless, men chose to do it, I think is a way to kind of push back against the military hierarchy while also being able to alleviate some of, the plight they were experiencing as soldiers. And so the takeaways, and this is kind of my favorite part because it's always evolving. And I think that I learned something from every talk I give, just from hearing what all of you think. And so to close out the talk today, I just want to give you my little bit on what I think these mean. and what they tell us as, scholars of the Civil War, where we think about it, we want to understand it. What does this tell us about the common Civil War soldier? And I argue that what these instances are, we like to hear about the glory of combat, and I think this is more about the realistic experiences of war and the day-to-day life of what men went through, and that it was about control or soldiers' consistent attempt to gain and maintain control over oneself. And it was a way to say, I'm going to obtain commodities and information that the army did not provide for me. And it was a way to be actively resistance against the grinding military life and hierarchy. And, breaking the rules was a way to kind of push back against the powers that be. And I feel like this demonstrates a soldier's independence, and their efforts to make their present situation better. Um, and most men, of course, developed a sense of respect and empathy for their enemy. But I also think fraternization was less about helping the enemy and more about what they could get for their individual self. Because soldiers are very individualistic. And so it was less like, I feel bad for my enemy, I'm going to give him this. It was more of like, I want that, so I'll give him this, right? And so the trade of newspapers, exchange of goods, and the negotiations of ceasefires demonstrates, as I argue, common soldiers' continuous fight for survival and their hard-nosed pragmatism. Now, I must note that one of my book chapters goes into this in depth, and it is definitely fraternization is a rehearsal for Reconstruction. And we can look at veterans magazines and veterans reunions, and that really tells us a lot more about this, especially with the lost cause and kind of what happens to fraternization after the war. And it definitely gets bastardized and it gets used to fit a narrative. But we don't have to look after the war to know what that narrative is going to be. We actually see it with fraternization during the war. And it really helps us understand specifically race relations after the war, because Southern soldiers did not negotiate ceasefires or trade newspapers or coffee and tobacco with USCTs. In fact, US soldiers would always know when the USCTs were on picket duty because the relentless firing never stopped. And even we see at times white US soldiers show more amnesty to their enemies in gray than their black brothers in blue. And so there's subliminal messages within these interactions that there was a priority of sectional reunification over racial equality. And unfortunately, fraternization tells us that story before the guns fall silent in 1865. And so that war of attrition, we still continue to fight through today. So nevertheless, taken as a collective, I always like to make that disclaimer because I don't want to romanticize fraternization, and I hope I didn't do that today. But nevertheless, the ways enemies fraternized, and more importantly, the reasons why, teach us how men fought the war on their own terms. And part of that process was a need to know mindset in order to determine how their present circumstances and future sacrifices would play out. So men, if there was any way that they could shape that, soldiers would try and grasp it. And I feel like they make their own ways to allow soldiering to be more manageable, and prove to themselves, as I like to say, that they were never a cog in the proverbial machine. And so that is what I have. So I'm going to stop my share and show my face and see your face.
Hang on a second. Oh, it helps if you use the correct mouse, Jim.